before we go over the grid system, I'd like to talk a little bit about the box model and styling in general on how rectangles in general are rendered by the browser, right? As far as the browser is concerned, the window is just one big rectangle that it needs to fill with many other smaller rectangles, right? A word might be a rectangle, a paragraph might be another rectangle, a header it would be another rectangle, and it's to figure out where all these rectangles need to fall on the page, right? To paint a page from left to right, from top to bottom. Yes? So everything is a rectangle as far as the browser is concerned, right? And it uses techniques such as or policies such as the box model to decide where should everything render. Right, so let's go over some of the examples that we have here. So here we have a box, an example here that is displaying a header, right? It's displaying a paragraph, and it's displaying then just one big rectangle down below, and it's being styled down below as this. Right? We have two boxes. Let's see. We have I guess we have another box down below. The first box here, I'm guessing this is it's this one right here. It's in the style. It's HTML is basically I guess H1, box 1. That's its ID, and then it's changing its background color to red, and we see that indeed it is red. It's setting its width and height to 500 and 200, so 500 wide and 200 high. The color, its inner color is white, meaning the foreground, the font color is white, which there it is. And then it's setting several things here. It's setting its margin to be 50 pixels. What the margin says is that how far is it from the rest of the content. So, for instance, there's 50 pixels above me, 50 pixels to my left, and also 50 pixels to my right. Okay. So margin is any spacing around me. Then I'm setting a border. So all around here, that's the border. So we have margins around me. We have borders after that. Then we have padding, and then we have the contents, right? So if we do it graphically, it looks something like this. So any piece of content that is being rendered, right, has these attributes, right? It has the distance between around me, right, which is the margin. So this is the margin. Then we have the border, right, border, right? And then you have any padding, this padding, and then you actually have the content. So the actual content lives right here. And when you set the width, it's this width. So this is the width. Right. So a trick question in interviews, it says, well, what is the width of they give you some HTML content. It says, well, what is the width of the how much space does this occupy on a screen, right? And you need to be careful that it's not just the width of the content, right? You need to consider the width of the padding, the width of the border, and the width of the margin, right? How much space is it, from here all the way, to here, right? It'll be, twice whatever the margin is, plus the border, plus the padding, plus the actual width, right? So be careful, right? Sometimes this is referred to as the outer width, right? And this is referred to as the inner width, right? So some trick questions. Also, each individual side, the left, the right, the top, the bottom, could be controlled individually, right? So here we have a margin, and we're not specifying which side. Is it the top, the bottom, the left, or the right? If you just specify the attribute by itself, it's understood as being all sides equal 50 pixels, right? Or you can be more specific that you want the margin at the top, the bottom, the right, the left, and specify which one it is. Same thing for the borders, for the padding. You can specify specifically the width for each one here. Here we specify the border width, right? And we say that it's 50 pixels, so it's all around, right? We're not specifying whether it's the left, the right, the top, the bottom. We can specify also the style, solid, or we can change it to be dotted or dashed. There's several stylings for the border. We also set the color of the border to be green, and then the inner padding, right, is 50 pixels. And notice that the red background was set earlier, background red, right? That's the color of the actual content, that includes the padding. Okay. Then down below, here's another example where we set the width and the height of an element. Right down below, there it is. It's a color blue. Notice that we never set the margin. We never set the border. Right. All those are 0 by default. We never set padding. Right. We're only setting the width and the height. Okay. And the foreground color is white and the background is blue. Right. But notice that even though this div is small enough that perhaps the content below could just wrap around, right? It does fit. Nevertheless, it's taking up the entire width of the page. Okay, the default behavior of these elements is to behave as a block element, right? Meaning I take up the entire width of the page regardless of what width you give me. Okay, my behavior is the same. I add vertical spacing because that is my behavior. All right, everybody okay? All right. Now, inline link position. Okay, let's go here. So here we have an example of that we have some content that is on top of other content, right? So by default, the position attribute is that the position is calculated automatically by the browser, right? Your position, the position of where the content is displayed is based on those two on those two policies, right? The block and the inline policy, right? Block says you take the entire width of the page, and depending on how big you are, you push everything down, right? You add vertical spacing down, so you push everything that is below you, everything that follows your in document order is just pushed down vertically. The other policy is the inline that says, well, you don't push anything down until you run out of space, right? You just grow from left to right up until you hit your limit on the right-hand side, and then you just wrap. And then everything else just flows, pushing everything to the right. If it doesn't fit, it just pushes down. Make sense? So you have those two policies. But the position attribute can be overwritten. It says, no, I don't want you to flow. Right? I don't want you to use those two policies. Instead, I can remove you. I can remove you from the normal calculation of the position. So meaning I don't want you to participate in those two policies, right? The block policy or the inline policy. Instead, I want to specifically and tell you exactly where you're going to be on the page. Meaning I want to take responsibility of where you're going to be on the page. Right? I'm not going to let these two policies decide where you're going to be on the page. I will tell you exactly where I want you to be. And to do that, we can override the position attribute. We can say position absolute. Okay? And in that case, we can tell it, I want you to be exactly right here. Meaning, measure 50 pixels from above and 50 pixels from the left, and that's where you're going to be. Okay? And that's exactly what we've done here. This box here is a background blue and color white, so it's this box right here, right? And notice that it's being placed in front of some other content. See that? And the reason that it's sitting in front is that it's not participating in the flow of the rest of the elements on the page. Okay? Because we have taken the responsibility of placing it, right? The browser is not even considering it. Right, to calculate the position of the other elements. Make sense? Right, so, for instance, that's why this content, we have not overwritten its position, so the browser is calculating its position. Right, but this one, we are taking responsibility because we have overwritten the position, and we're telling exactly where to display. Make sense? Right? So when that happens, when we take over some of the rendering, we have to be careful, right? Because the browser will make every effort to make sure that all the content has its own dedicated rectangle, right? That nothing is overlapping. Everything is very well defined. The rectangle, the width, the height, and nothing is overlapping. Overrunning other content. That everything has a place, and every place has something in it. Okay, but when we override it, okay, you can have these kinds of things, right? Things being on top of each other. So when that happens, we need to consider if things are now on top of each other, right? We need to consider that we need to control that as well, right? Perhaps we don't want certain things to overlap, or maybe we do want that, right? We need to be able to control it. Before we introduced the position attribute, it was just a 2D world, right? Things just flow from top to bottom, from left to right. There was no depth. Okay, it was only strictly 2D. But when you start controlling the position, right, and things start being in front of each other, then you're introducing a third dimension, right? And so that's measured with the depth, right, of some elements being rendered on top of other elements. Yes, right. Now the default behavior is that if an element is positioned in front of another, right, the decision of which one is in front of which is based on the order of the document, right? Meaning elements that are defined later are rendered on top of elements that were defined earlier, right? Which makes sense, right? The browser, as it reads the content, it renders, right? And when it gets to later elements, right, it renders them last, right? So if they fall on top of the earlier elements, well, they're on top of them. Make sense? Right? But maybe it's not rendering the way we want it, right? So we can take over that default behavior. So let me grab a couple of content here, and let me illustrate. Here we have. Am I recording? Yes. So let's go in lectures, and let's go here in and illustrate this index z index. So this code declares here's 3 rectangular elements: box 1, box 2, and box 3. Okay, and normally they would render as follows. Nope. Okay, so let me navigate there. This is under lectures, under Z index. There it is. So that's the normal rendering, right? We have just 3 rectangular spaces. They say exactly the same thing. Let me go back here and let's uncomment this, and let's just change their background colors, just to show you. There they are, right? That's their colors, yellow, blue, and red. And let's start adding a couple of things in there. Let's add maybe some width and height. Okay, so we've added width and height, right? And notice that that even though the blue box would fit perfectly to the right of that yellow box, right? It doesn't behave that way, right? It's a div. They render by default as block elements. So even though they're small, they add vertical spacing. Okay. So now let's now add a position. Let's add position. Now position is going to remove them from the regular calculation of where they would be rendered, right? And they would fall on top of each other. Okay. And notice that box one is yellow, so that gets rendered first. So box one gets rendered first, then box two, and then box three. Yes, and one is yellow, box two is blue, and then red. And notice that they're rendered in that way, right? The yellow gets rendered first, and then blue on top of the yellow, and then red is the last one and gets rendered on top of the blue. Okay? It follows the document order in which things are rendered, right? But we can override that. We can override it and say, no, I don't want to do that, right? So instead, I want to maybe do it in reverse order, right? Where I want to be yellow on top, then blue, and then red at the bottom. So to do that, we can change that by the index, right? Z index, right? What's the Z depth of each one of these, right? So if you re-render this, it puts blue on top of others. Okay, so in this case, notice that blue, and so box 2 and box 1 have the same value for the index. So if you have the same index, then the document order wins, right? So whoever is last, right, to render, then that one wins. So in this case, I guess it would be between the yellow and the blue. Right, so I guess red is the last one, right? Then yellow and then blue, right? Or we can have the yellow have a higher index so that it's on top of each other. Right, so we can have the inverse behavior, right, of who gets rendered first and last. Make sense? Okay. So be careful if you can have content that it goes on top of each other, right? Make sure that it's intentional. Meaning you intended it to have something on top of each other, not by mistake. Right? The TAs are going to be looking for these things, right? They're going to be moving things around and see if things are overlapping. And if they're overlapping, that it was an intentional overlap and that the Z index is set correctly. Okay, so play around with that. And finally, let's see, float. So float, grab that. Float. Let's grab that index. Let's talk about now about float. Okay, so let me navigate there. And that's under float. Let's do float. There it is. Let me make this. Let me remove the style first. So at first, this is the default, right? These are just three divs, right? Three rectangles. By default, they render from top to bottom, right? Following the block policy, right? Everything renders. Notice that block elements, their width is determined by the width of the window, right? And then their height is determined by whatever's inside. You see that? So the width is determined by the size of the window of the parent container. So the width is determined by the width of the parent, but its height, right, is determined by the size of the children, of whatever's inside. Right? If it doesn't fit, right, it just grows taller to fit it, to make it fit. See that? Right? That's one of its behaviors that it allows it to be responsive, to behave responsively. Okay. So let's add some colors so that we can follow this along. Let's first, so let's remove this first. So we have some colors, right? But now we're going to let's look at the styling first. Notice that we have yellow, blue, and red being applied. There it is, .red, .blue, and .yellow. Okay, with the background color. But notice that we're applying another style, right? COL, col, as in column. Right? We want these to behave as columns. So to do that, we're going to add. We're going to add an additional class. Right? We're going to style it and say that grab all elements that have the column class, right? Give them a width, whatever width you want, 200, and then float them left. What this says is that right, the way it renders is that we're making them behave a little bit as if these were inline elements. Right? We're saying do not behave like your default block, right? Behave a little bit more like an inline element, right? Where elements to your right are just going to flow around you. They're going to wrap around you, right? And if you apply to several of these together, you get the behavior of having these render as if they were columns. Okay, and notice that they begin to behave as if they were inline. Right? Notice that if I make this smaller and smaller, notice that the element starts to wrap. See that it doesn't fit, so it just wraps around. Right? It has this wrapping behavior. If I make it even smaller, this wraps and it becomes and it goes into the next line. You see that? Right. So what we like to be able to do is control this behavior. Right. Make use of this feature, right, so that we can start having elements, be able to render them not only just vertically, right, but render them also in columns, right. We used to use tables quite a while ago. We don't use tables anymore. Instead, we use these kinds of mechanisms, these kinds of techniques, right, to render them in columns. Okay, so let's make use of this technique to introduce the notion of the grid systems. All right, so let's do that next.